Today we are going to talk about finding the surface area of square pyramids. We already know that the surface area is the sum of all faces of a 3D object combined together. Same thing for our square pyramids. So let's take a look. We've got our 3D figure here. We know it's a square pyramid because it's got a base that's rectangular. In this case, it is a square. And then it's got 4 lateral faces that all meet at a vertex opposite of that base. Okay, so when we are finding the surface area, the first thing that we're going to do is draw our net. Now, I know because this is a square pyramid, it's got 5 faces, that base, and then 4 lateral faces. Therefore, my net needs to also have 5 faces. I start with that bottom, and then I typically peel away those lateral faces. You definitely could draw this net differently, but this is probably the most common way. So after I've drawn my net, I label all my dimensions. Because this is a square, all my triangles, my lateral faces will actually be the same. Once I've labeled my dimensions, I go ahead and find the area of each of my faces. So my bottom has a dimension of 49 meters. We got that from 7 times 7. Then I move on to my triangular faces. Because they are triangles, I must remember to use my area formula for a triangle. Okay, that's a very common mistake that's made. We forget to use the triangle formula rather than the rectangle formula. In this instance, this will not always be the case, but in this instance, all of my triangles are the same dimension. We multiply half times 7 times 10, getting us areas for each of these 4 rectangles to be 35 meters squared. So once I found the area for each of these, I set up sort of my formula to help me kind of keep track. I add together the area of my bottom, area of a side, a side, a side, a side. Substitute in all my area dimensions from up here, getting me a surface area of 189 meters squared. We want to remember that this is area still, so we are using meters squared. So step 1 was to determine what our figure was and draw the net for it. Step 2 was to label my dimensions. Step 3 was to find the area of each individual face. And step 4 was to find the sum of all those faces together. All right, let's try one more together. Down here, we also have a square pyramid. Now, I know that this is a square pyramid because I actually have only 2 dimensions. So then it's the assumption that this is also 6 because it's not labeled anything else. That 11 4/10 shows me that that's the height for all my lateral faces. So again, I label my net. It's 11 4/10. And now I go from here. I can label that this is the bottom and then that these are all sides. Okay. So from here, I go ahead and set up my areas. I've already done step 1, determine what my figure is, and draw its net. I have labeled the dimensions I need. For a square pyramid, I need less dimensions. I actually like to make sure for my square, for example, I know I need those 2 dimensions, so I do like to label the ones that I will be using. Okay, so my bottom is a square or rectangle shape, so I go base times height or length times width, length times width, which is 6 times 6 equals 36. All right, next up, we've got our sides. Now, I do have 4 sides. I like to label. For example, when we have a rectangular one, the triangles will have different dimensions. So I just go left, right, front and back, and then determine my dimensions from there. I would label that further here if I had a rectangular pyramid. Okay, so for here, again, these are triangles, so I must use my triangle formula. My base here is 6, and my height is 11 4/10. 1/2 times 6 times 11 4/10. 1/2 times 6 times 11 4/10. And 1/2 times 6 times 11 4/10. Again, if this is a rectangle, you will have different dimensions here, so you need to pay close attention. So I get out my calculator and multiply 1/2 times 6 times 11 4/10, which is going to get me 34 2/10. Again, because this is a square, I will have the same dimensions. That won't always be the case. All right, so now I need to find my surface area. And I do that by adding together my bottom plus my left side, my right side, my front side, and my back side. Okay, my bottom dimension is 36. My left side is 34 2/10. Again, this time that gets all repeated. You cannot count on that for always, though, so I will lay them all out. So now I've set up my formula. I've plugged in my numbers, substituted them in. I take out my calculator, I add these all up, and that will get me a surface area of 172 and 8/10 yards square. So the entire surface of my square pyramid in this case would be 172 and 8/10 yards squared. So to do that, again, I determined what my figure is. I made a net for that figure. And then step 2 was to label my dimensions. Step 3 was to go through and find the area of every single individual face I have before our final step 4 to add them all up and get our sum, our surface area.